Dear friends, welcome to my channel. This is Taras BEREZOVETS with you. Today we will talk about the most important events on the military and international agenda. I have been off the air for a few days. This was due to an important business trip I took on assignment from the Territorial Defense Forces Command. I will tell you more about this in one of the upcoming episodes. Today, first and foremost, we will talk about the negotiations that are scheduled to take place on June 2nd, on Monday, let me remind you, in Istanbul. It is expected that another round of talks will be held between representatives of the Ukrainian and Russian delegations. Of course, as usual, there was immediately a scandal involved here. The Ukrainian side insisted that their head, Vladimir Medinsky, Putin's aide, let me remind you, an ethnic Ukrainian born in Ukraine, not be present at these negotiations. He spent the first years of his life here. However, like all traitors, he does everything possible to harm his historical homeland as much as he can. By the way, as reported by Western media, the Americans also requested that Medinsky be excluded from the negotiating group, since he poses a serious, let's put it this way, serious obstacle, is unconstructive, behaves in a completely rude, boorish manner, and, despite never having served a single day in the army, talks about how the Russian army will fight in Ukraine forever if necessary. He likes to talk about the Great Northern War, which the Russian Empire fought for 21 years, and draws other historical analogies. Well, to be fair, he hasn't talked about the Pechenegs yet, but nevertheless. He's an interesting character in terms of just how despicable one can become in order to please his new Moscow masters. In general, such metamorphoses have happened not only with Mr. Medinsky, but for centuries, all those who entered the service of the Kremlin from the Ukrainian elite or who were born in Ukraine behaved in roughly the same way. So it seems that Medinsky will still end up in Istanbul, despite the requests from both the Ukrainian and American sides. This is yet another reason to believe that these negotiations are not important to Putin. First and foremost, he is counting on disrupting these negotiations in one way or another. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side is preparing to present its own version of the memorandum, which has already been handed over to representatives of the Allies and possibly to Russia. This was reported by the American publication, the New York Times. By the way, the Russian side refuses to provide the text of the memorandum document, stating that Ukrainian negotiators will only see it in Istanbul on June 2nd. Once again, this is a violation of all international diplomatic norms. Essentially, it is a slap in the face. And yet another irrefutable piece of evidence that the Russian side does not actually want these negotiations. So what does the Ukrainian memorandum contain? The New York Times, citing a high-ranking Ukrainian official, claims that the key goal of the memorandum is to achieve a ceasefire on land, at sea, and in the air in order to move on to negotiations for a broader agreement. The Ukrainian side is also concerned that Medinsky will once again bring some unfeasible demands to these negotiations, proposing conditions that Kiev will naturally be forced to reject, and thus Moscow will immediately start proclaiming that the talks have collapsed precisely because of the Ukrainian side. Most likely it will be the same nonsense that Medinsky has brought before. Let me remind you the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from territory not controlled by the Russian army. This refers to the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. Also the absence, meaning the rejection of NATO membership. By the way, Nebenzia has already stated this at the UN Security Council. So give up on NATO, declare official neutrality, stop the supply of Western weapons, and of course, end mobilization. Right? And that's even though just today another video featuring Russian armed forces soldiers was released. And there, as they say, is a complete royal flush. There you have citizens of the People's Republic of China, Kenya, North Korea, Colombia, I'm just recalling from memory, and about a dozen more countries, mostly from the African continent and South America, as well as Southeast Asia. In short, you stop your mobilization, and meanwhile we'll be recruiting conscripts from all over the world, luring them in with Russian military contracts, and then wiping them out out. Well, obviously, it's easier to wipe them out quickly. Then basically, there's no one left to pay the money to. And as for the numerous cases of non-payment to relatives, many Russian pro-war ZID channels are making a lot of noise about that. For his part, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stated that in order to unblock these negotiations, which he also does not believe will succeed, he would like to see a direct phone conversation take place between Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. It is he, according to Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who can help bring the situation out of the current impasse. He also suggested as an option possible negotiations involving Zelensky, Putin, Trump, and himself. This was stated by Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. Let me remind you, he was already present in the negotiation room on May 16th. However, the Turks did not actually participate in the negotiations at that time. They were essentially there as hosts and observers. As Hakan Fidan, the former head of Turkish intelligence, stated, "We sincerely believe that after the first and second rounds of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, a meeting between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky under Erdogan's leadership could follow." This was stated by the Turkish foreign minister during his visit to the Ukrainian capital, where he met with Zelensky. Fidan had also previously visited Moscow. This is what you call shuttle diplomacy. Will it end in success? So far, there are no signs indicating that the Russian side might accept this proposal. However, Zelensky has already confirmed that Ukraine is ready for such a meeting. Zelensky is ready to meet with Putin in the presence of Trump. Zelensky himself stated that if a bilateral meeting is inconvenient for Putin, or if everyone wants the meeting to be trilateral, he doesn't mind. He's ready for any format. The Kremlin, through Peskov, stated that Putin is ready for a meeting, but it can only happen after the Ukrainian side agrees to the conditions for ending the war. Well, we already remember all that. That is, refusal to join NATO, the Russian language, the church, withdraw from the 4 regions, surrender them, that's it, stop mobilization, stop receiving weapons from Western allies, and so on. In other words, only after that is Putin ready to negotiate with Zelensky. Again, I'll repeat once more, these conditions have not been met. Trump, of course, immediately responded by saying that he is very irritated that Putin continues to strike Kiev and other Ukrainian cities and gave him another 2 weeks. That is, every time he announces a 2-week deadline to them, and then something is supposed to happen. But in the end, that something never actually happens. Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy on Ukraine, I remind you, meanwhile stated that Washington understands Moscow's concerns about NATO's eastward expansion. And in particular, there have already been discussions that NATO will have to give up on admitting Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and other countries. Even though, for example, Moldova is not seeking NATO membership at all, let me remind you, it is a neutral country and is only planning to join the European Union. Nevertheless, according to the Ukrainian Service of Radio Liberty, NATO is not discussing Putin's demand to provide written guarantees that the alliance will not expand eastward. Putin himself, as well as Lavrov and other representatives of the Kremlin's criminal regime, have repeatedly spoken about these guarantees in the past. One of the sources in NATO stated that a written commitment is not something that can be obtained so easily. And there is also the question of whether Zelensky will participate in the upcoming NATO summit, which, let me remind you, is set to take place very soon in June. Previously, Trump stated that he might oppose such participation by Volodymyr Zelensky in the summit, which this time will be held in The Hague in June. Zelensky's attendance had previously been in question. And on Friday, this position that the United States opposes Ukraine joining the alliance was also confirmed by Keith Kellogg. That's it. At the moment, Representatives of the governments of the United Kingdom and France, who are the main driving forces behind the creation of the coalition of the willing, have stated that there is a high likelihood of a scenario in which the United States and Donald Trump withdraw from negotiations on Ukraine. Because of this, European allies have decided to focus on providing military aid to Ukraine without American support, instead of sending peacekeeping contingents after a possible ceasefire. This was reported by the British publication The Telegraph. A source for the publication also said, referring to negotiations in The Hague, Netherlands, that the main topic was how to provide the necessary support to Ukraine while the US continues to offer certain types of assistance. For example, intelligence data. Naturally, everyone is waiting for Trump's response and the introduction of new additional sanctions. These sanctions still have not been imposed, and all of this is creating considerable anxiety on the eve of the next NATO summit. Meanwhile, Donald Trump himself, apparently in an effort to somewhat ease the tension among allies, has decided to keep a representative of the American military command in the position of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe. According to Reuters, Trump has already discussed this. Previously, there were concerns that Trump would not nominate an American commander for the position of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe. But now, in fact, he has settled on a candidate, and that is three-star General Alexis Grinkevich. It is reported that Donald Trump privately conveyed this information to the alliance's Secretary General, Mark Rutte. U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Alexis Grinkevich is one of the most decorated and highest-ranking American officers, who is expected to take the position of Supreme Allied Commander Europe of the combined NATO armed forces in Europe, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and thus replace another American general, Christopher Cavoli, who has held this position since the beginning of the war in 2022. Cavoli is in close contact with the current commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Oleksandr Syrsky, as well as his predecessor, Valery Zaluzhny. At present, Lieutenant General three-star General Alexis Grinkevich is the head of operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces. This information has not yet been officially commented on by the Pentagon or NATO. I looked up information regarding Alexis Grinkevich. By the way, the spelling of his last name matches the Ukrainian transcription in the English version. And I found out in particular some information about him. There's practically nothing about him on the internet, but judging by indirect information that is available, Alexis Grinkevich, whose father's name was Gregory, that is Hrihori, apparently comes from the Ukrainian community. But again, I'll repeat, this is based on indirect evidence. Alexei Hrihorovich Rinkevich. That's how his name and surname sound in the original. Apparently, if this information is indeed confirmed, then it appears that an ethnic Ukrainian may soon take the highest military post in NATO in Europe. Let me remind you, he is a lieutenant general in the United States Air Force. He has been serving in the U.S. Armed Forces since 1993. He has been awarded a huge number of American honors in particular, and is primarily known for being greatly respected by his subordinates. And if, of course, this does happen, it's clear that there's no secret plan by Trump here. He's not trying to please Ukraine or Ukrainians in this case. But I'll repeat once again, if this information is indeed confirmed that Grinkevich comes from a Ukrainian family, then this is undoubtedly also very good news in terms of moral satisfaction. Just imagine what it will be like when a Ukrainian lieutenant general is not only commanding NATO armed forces in Europe, but also giving orders regarding deterrence or the conduct of various operations and exercises. And for Russian propaganda, this will be like rubbing salt in the wound. One can only imagine how furious Russian propaganda will become. Solovyov, all those characters, Simonyan, Skabiva, Popov, and so on and so forth. And the fact that they have been given the specific task of fighting Western propaganda and influences, especially those that undermine the honor of the Russian Führer, is evidenced by yet another ridiculous, amusing decision. The Kirovsky District Court of Omsk has declared 12 web pages illegal in Russia. These are sites featuring images that compare Putin to Adolf Hitler, as well as a number of other memes. This was reported by Radio Liberty. Specifically, the ban includes edited photographs in which Putin is given a mustache and hairstyle in the style of Adolf Hitler. Images from the film Hitler is Kaputt, published on those same pages, have also been banned. Most of the photos and images were taken at protest rallies. A photograph was also banned that shows a woman holding a sign reading "Patla, drink poison," and "Before you're served lead." And also a photo of Putin styled as a cover of the satirical magazine Crocodile, with the caption, "The court has begun to consider the case on its merits. The creature stated that it is not guilty." But we can see how painfully and acutely the Kremlin reacts to any hints of comparison with Adolf Hitler. And now this has in fact been confirmed with documentation. This very court, as they say, this is practically a confession. The day before, the media reported that apparently Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, managed to carry out a successful operation in Vladivostok. That's in the Russian Far East, just to remind you. 2 explosions occurred in Desantnaya Bay, after which the area was cordoned off by Russian security services. In Primorsky Krai, it was announced that representatives of the relevant agencies had dealt with the aftermath of the incident. Traffic was also blocked between Shamora Bay and the village of Shchitovaya. That's a good name, Shchitovaya, especially for those who know English. Shit, I remind you, translates as crap. That's the village of Shchitovaya for you. Meanwhile, a large number of police cars, ambulances, and people in military uniforms gathered at the turnoff to the bay. Helicopters were also spotted. Everyone was being checked. Local residents and passers-by had their documents inspected and vehicles were searched. According to the VHHKO GPU Telegram channel, some large objects covered with tarpaulins were taken out of the bay under guard. It is reported that this location is the permanent deployment site of the 155th Brigade of the Pacific Fleet Moscow Infantry. Let me remind you, this is the same brigade that has already gone through about 5 different personnel rotations, has been involved in a significant number of war crimes, and was completely wiped out during the offensive on Vuhledar. It also took part in battles with Ukrainian defense forces in the Kursk region, and in particular, it was reported that the 47th Battalion was hit there. In this particular case, it is reported that the number of casualties from these explosions is unknown. It is also reported that, according to the official version, the cause of the explosions was allegedly the detonation of cylinders with a propane-butane mixture in one of the vehicles. Well, as they say, we would probably hear a lot more versions like this. Well, if the hands of the GUR have managed to reach all the way to the Far East, to our military intelligence officers, then of course we can only congratulate them on carrying out such a brilliant military operation against Russian war criminals, just as the GUR had warned. Their reach will extend to everyone. And in fact, this is not the first and will not be the last such case. Among other important news, though with a somewhat satirical undertone, is the statement by Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev that Kazakhstan does not plan to join Putin's favorite toy, known as BRICS. Let me remind you, the bloc originally united 5 countries that joined it: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Several dozen other countries have also applied to join. Recently, Putin held another BRICS summit in Kazan with great pomp. By the way, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev attended, but despite the fact that BRICS includes 2 of Kazakhstan's strategic allies, China and Russia, he still does not intend to join for practical reasons, and he considers the status of this organization insufficient. He stated, "Let's see how effective BRICS will be as a unified organization. For now, Kazakhstan will remain an observer, and time will tell what happens next." Tokayev had received corresponding proposals to join BRICS, persistent ones, even at the end of 2024. Kazakhstan itself has been a BRICS partner since January 1st, 2025. Now, in addition to the 5 founding countries, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Indonesia have also joined. Since February, BRICS has temporarily suspended the admission of new members, but as we can see, Kazakhstan is not planning to join, and Donald Trump has even declared that BRICS is dead. Well, Trump, as they say, never minces his words. Once again, he made a direct and clear statement. Remember, I recently told you some amusing stories about how one of the Russian military officers, the commander of an air defense division, Yuri Dashkin, stated on the Russia 24 TV channel that Putin's helicopter came under attack from 46 Ukrainian drones. Well, it turned out that this entire story was completely fabricated from beginning to end. The Moscow Times writes about this, citing 4 separate sources in the Kremlin and the Russian government. They say that this story was promoted in the media to convince Russians that the president is not hiding behind others, but is instead taking risks and making sacrifices. And at the time, I said that Dashkin would either be rewarded or exiled for this. Well, apparently Dashkin managed to throw himself under the train. He came up with it, or rather, he took part in this whole story that was invented for him by Kremlin political strategists. And now he's been exposed. One Kremlin official stated that no one would ever allow such criminal lawlessness, not even in their worst nightmare, which in fact is exactly what needed to be proven. This whole story was made up from beginning to end. Well, as they say, who would have doubted it? Take care of yourselves, friends. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for updates. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the armed forces, glory to the Ukrainian Special Forces, glory to the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces. As always, this was Major Taras Berezovets of the Ukrainian Army with you. Until next time, bye-bye.